Marcus Thompson had always been trouble. At 23, he carried himself with the swagger of someone who believed the world owed him something. His father owned 3 successful restaurants in downtown London, which meant Marcus never really had to work for anything. Money came easy, respect he demanded, and consequences were something that happened to other people. On that cold Tuesday morning in March, Marcus was nursing a hangover from another wild night out with his friends. They had spent the evening bar hopping through the expensive parts of the city, throwing money around like confetti and treating service staff like personal servants. Marcus particularly enjoyed making waiters and security guards uncomfortable with his entitled attitude and crude jokes. His phone buzzed with messages from his latest girlfriend, Sarah, who was getting tired of his behavior. She had been complaining about how he treated people, especially those in service jobs. Marcus dismissed her concerns with a laugh. In his mind, people who worked those jobs were beneath him, and they should be grateful for any attention he gave them. The day started like any other. Marcus rolled out of his king-sized bed in his expensive apartment, funded entirely by his father's generosity. He grabbed his designer clothes from the floor, still reeking of alcohol and cigarettes from the night before. Looking at himself in the mirror, he grinned at his reflection. Today was going to be another day of doing whatever he wanted. His friends had planned a tourist day around London, not because they were interested in history or culture, but because they thought it would be funny to mess with the serious-looking guards at various important buildings. Marcus loved these kinds of adventures. The more uptight and professional someone looked, the more he enjoyed trying to get a reaction out of them. After a quick shower and an even quicker breakfast, Marcus met up with his crew outside a coffee shop. There was Jake, whose family owned a chain of electronics stores, and Tommy, whose trust fund meant he had never worked a day in his life. Together they formed a trio of privileged young men who had never faced real consequences for their actions. They started their day at the Tower of London, where they spent time trying to make the beefeaters break character. Marcus would make jokes about their uniforms and ask ridiculous questions about their jobs. The guards, trained professionals, ignored them completely, which only frustrated Marcus more. Next, they moved to Westminster, where they spotted the mounted police. Marcus thought it would be hilarious to pretend he was going to pet the horses, getting uncomfortably close despite the officers' warnings to keep back. The police were patient but firm, telling the group to move along. By afternoon, Marcus was getting bored. The guards and officers they had encountered were too professional to give him the reaction he craved. He wanted someone to lose their temper, to prove that he could get under anyone's skin. His friends were starting to lose interest too, checking their phones and talking about heading to a pub instead. That's when Jake suggested they visit Buckingham Palace. The royal guards there were famous for their stoic expressions and complete stillness no matter what happened around them. Marcus's eyes lit up with excitement. This was perfect. These guards were supposed to be absolutely unbreakable, which made them the ultimate challenge. They took the underground to the palace, Marcus's mind already racing with ideas about how to get a reaction. He had seen videos online of tourists trying to make the guards laugh or move, usually failing completely. But Marcus was different. He was special. He was sure he could succeed where others had failed. The afternoon sun was setting as they arrived at the palace gates. Crowds of tourists were taking photos and admiring the famous red-uniformed guards standing at attention. Marcus studied them carefully, looking for the perfect target. He wanted the guard who looked the most serious, the most professional, the most unbreakable. His eyes settled on a guard standing near the main entrance. The man was tall, probably in his 30s, with perfect posture and an expression that seemed carved from stone. His uniform was immaculate, his rifle held in the exact position required by protocol. Everything about him screamed discipline and professionalism. Marcus smiled to himself. This was going to be fun. He had no idea that the man he was targeting, Guard Corporal James Mitchell, had served 2 tours in Afghanistan and had seen things that would make Marcus's privilege problems seem like minor inconveniences. James had earned his position through years of dedication, sacrifice, and unwavering service to his country. As Marcus approached the guard, tourists moved aside, sensing that something was about to happen. Some began taking out their phones, expecting to capture another failed attempt at breaking a royal guard's composure. They had no idea they were about to witness something that would change Marcus's life forever. The stage was set. Marcus, full of arrogance and entitlement, was about to learn a lesson that his father's money couldn't buy, and his privileged upbringing had never taught him. Guard Corporal Mitchell stood ready, unaware that this moment would become a story told throughout the military for years to come. What happened next would shatter Marcus's worldview and prove that some people's respect must be earned, never demanded. Marcus strutted toward Guard Corporal James Mitchell with the confidence of someone who had never faced real opposition. The crowd of tourists formed a loose semicircle, phones already recording what they expected to be another harmless encounter between a cocky young man and an unflappable royal guard. "Watch this," Marcus whispered to his friends, loud enough for nearby tourists to hear. "I'm going to make this tin soldier break." He started with the usual tactics that amateur troublemakers always tried. Marcus waved his hands in front of James's face, trying to block his line of sight. The guard didn't even blink. His eyes remained fixed straight ahead, his breathing steady and controlled. Years of training had prepared him for exactly this type of situation. Growing frustrated by the lack of response, Marcus escalated his behavior. He began making jokes about the guard's uniform, calling him a dress-up soldier and a tourist attraction. He circled around James like a predator, making crude comments about his rifle and asking if it was even real. The guard's training held firm. James had dealt with drunk football fans, aggressive protesters, and confused tourists. He understood that his job required absolute professionalism, regardless of provocation. Every muscle in his body remained disciplined, every breath controlled. But Marcus interpreted this restraint as weakness rather than strength. In his twisted worldview, anyone who didn't fight back was automatically inferior. He had spent his entire life surrounded by people who either feared his father's influence or wanted access to his family's money. No one had ever truly stood up to him. "Come on, toy soldier," Marcus taunted, his voice getting louder. "Don't you have anything to say? Or are you just another mindless robot?" Some tourists began feeling uncomfortable. A few parents pulled their children away from the scene, sensing that the situation was becoming inappropriate. Others continued filming, fascinated by the one-sided confrontation unfolding before them. Jake and Tommy watched their friend with growing unease. They had seen Marcus push boundaries before, but something felt different about this situation. The guard wasn't just ignoring Marcus, he was absorbing every insult, every gesture, every provocation with the stillness of someone who possessed genuine inner strength. Marcus, however, was too caught up in his performance to notice these subtle signs. He was playing to the crowd now, trying to impress the tourists and humiliate the guard. In his mind, he was the star of this show, and everyone was watching him dominate this inferior person. That's when Marcus made his first critical error. He reached out and knocked the guard's hat slightly askew. It was a small gesture, but it crossed a line. James's jaw tightened imperceptibly, the only sign that he had registered the physical contact. His training demanded that he maintain position, but every instinct told him the situation was escalating toward something serious. The crowd gasped softly. Even tourists who didn't understand military protocol knew that touching a royal guard was inappropriate. Marcus, however, took their reaction as encouragement. He had finally gotten some kind of response, even if it wasn't from the guard himself. Emboldened by what he saw as success, Marcus decided to push even further. He began making personal attacks, questioning James's intelligence, his background, and his worth as a human being. The words poured out of him like poison, each sentence more vicious than the last. James had heard worse during his military service, but there was something particularly grating about this privileged young man's assumption that he could treat anyone this way without consequences. Still, his discipline held. He had sworn an oath to maintain his post, and he would honor that commitment regardless of personal feelings. Marcus's friends were now actively trying to get his attention, making subtle gestures for him to back down. They could see something, in the guard's posture that Marcus was missing. This wasn't a man who was weak or defeated. This was someone exercising incredible restraint. But Marcus was beyond listening to reason. The adrenaline of public attention and the thrill of apparent dominance had taken over completely. He felt invincible, untouchable, like he could do anything without facing consequences. That's when he made the decision that would change everything. Looking around at the crowd of tourists still filming, Marcus decided he needed to do something truly outrageous. Something that would make him the star of social media and prove once and for all that he was superior to this servant. He took a step back, wound up his leg, and delivered a sharp kick directly to James's shin. The sound of his designer boot connecting with the guard's leg echoed across the courtyard like a gunshot. The crowd went completely silent. Phones stopped recording. Parents covered their children's eyes. Even Jake and Tommy stepped backward, their faces pale with shock and horror. Marcus stood there grinning, proud of his accomplishment, completely unaware that he had just committed assault against a member of Her Majesty's Guard. He looked around at the stunned faces, expecting applause or laughter, but finding only expressions of disbelief and disgust. Guard Corporal James Mitchell felt the pain shoot up his leg, but more than that, he felt something snap inside his chest. Not his discipline, which remained intact, but his willingness to absorb abuse from someone who clearly had no understanding of respect, service, or basic human decency. For the first time since taking his post that morning, James's eyes moved. They shifted downward just for a moment to look at the spot where he had been kicked. Then they lifted again, not to their original forward position, but to lock directly onto Marcus's face. In that moment, Marcus finally saw what his friends had been trying to warn him about. This wasn't the face of a weak man or a mindless robot. This was the face of someone who had earned his position through blood, sweat, and unwavering dedication to something bigger than himself. The game had changed, and Marcus was no longer in control. The moment James's eyes locked onto Marcus's face, the entire atmosphere changed. What had been a one-sided performance suddenly became something much more serious. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine as he stared into the eyes of a man who had seen real combat, real hardship, and real consequences. James didn't speak. He didn't need to. His eyes communicated everything that words couldn't express. They told the story of a man who had earned his position through merit, not money. They spoke of discipline that came from genuine strength, not the fake confidence that money and privilege provided. For the first time in his life, Marcus felt truly small. Not because someone was yelling at him or threatening him, but because he was facing someone whose quiet dignity made his own behavior look pathetic by comparison. The confidence that had carried him through 23 years of entitled living began to crack. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. The crowd of tourists remained frozen, unsure whether they should intervene, call for help, or simply leave. Some had stopped filming out of respect while others continued recording, sensing they were witnessing something unprecedented. Then James did something that no one expected. Instead of breaking his position or calling for backup, he slowly, deliberately returned his gaze to its original forward position. His face resumed the perfect stoic expression required of a royal guard. His posture remained flawless. To an outside observer, it might have seemed like nothing had happened at all, but Marcus knew better. In those few seconds of eye contact, he had received a message clearer than any words could convey. You have made a mistake, and there will be consequences. The realization hit Marcus like a physical blow. For the first time, he understood that his actions might actually result in real problems. Not the kind of minor inconveniences his father's lawyers could solve, but genuine, serious consequences that money couldn't fix. His friends Jake and Tommy immediately rushed to his side, grabbing his arms and trying to pull him away from the scene. They had recognized the gravity of the situation even if Marcus hadn't. Assaulting a royal guard wasn't just inappropriate behavior, it was a criminal offense that could result in arrest, prosecution, and serious jail time. We need to leave, Jake whispered urgently. Right now. But it was already too late. Other guards had noticed the commotion, and palace security was already moving toward their position. Marcus could see uniformed officers approaching from multiple directions, their expressions professional but unmistakably serious. The crowd of tourists began to disperse, sensing that the entertainment was over and something more serious was about to begin. Parents hurried their children away from the scene, while others lingered at a safe distance, still filming but ready to run if necessary. Marcus tried to regain his composure, to summon the arrogant confidence that had carried him through the confrontation. But looking around at the approaching security officers, the disapproving faces of the remaining tourists, and the steady, unchanging presence of the guard he had assaulted, he felt his bravado crumbling. "Look, this was just a joke," he said, to no one in particular, his voice lacking its earlier confidence. "Everyone's being way too serious about this." The first security officer to reach them was a woman in her 40s, with the bearing of someone who had dealt with every type of troublemaker imaginable. She looked at Marcus with the expression of a teacher who had caught a student cheating, and was disappointed rather than surprised. "Sir, I need you to come with me," she said calmly. "We have some questions about your behavior toward one of our guards." Marcus looked to his friends for support, but Jake and Tommy were already backing away, their faces pale with worry. They knew that being associated with this incident could have serious consequences for their own futures, and their loyalty to Marcus didn't extend to risking their own reputations and freedom. "This is ridiculous," Marcus protested, but his voice cracked slightly. "I barely touched him. These guards are supposed to be tough, right? What's the big deal?" The security officer's expression didn't change. She had heard these excuses countless times before from people who thought their status or connections made them immune to consequences. In her experience, the louder someone protested their innocence, the more guilty they usually were. More officers arrived, forming a loose circle around Marcus and ensuring he couldn't simply walk away from the situation. They weren't aggressive or threatening, but their presence made it clear that this was no longer a casual conversation. James, meanwhile, continued to maintain his position with perfect discipline. He hadn't moved a muscle since returning his gaze to its proper forward position. But everyone present could sense that something fundamental had shifted. The guard who had absorbed insults and provocations with stoic patience had been physically assaulted, and the wheels of justice were now in motion. Marcus began to panic as the reality of his situation became clear. He pulled out his phone, frantically, scrolling through his contacts to find his father's number. If anyone could fix this mess, it would be the man whose money and influence had always protected him from the consequences of his actions. "I need to call my father," he announced, as if this would somehow change the nature of what he had done. The security officer nodded politely. "You'll have the opportunity to make phone calls once we've completed our initial assessment of the situation." For the first time, Marcus began to understand that his father's influence might not be enough to save him this time. Assaulting a member of the Royal Guard wasn't the kind of problem that could be solved with a donation or a phone call to the right person. This was a matter of national security, military protocol, and criminal law. As the officers began to escort him away from the scene, Marcus turned back one last time to look at James. The guard remained in perfect position, his face expressionless, his bearing unchanged. But Marcus could swear he saw the faintest hint of satisfaction in the man's eyes. The lesson was just beginning, and Marcus was about to learn that some people's respect can never be bought, only earned through actions worthy of it. The security office inside Buckingham Palace was nothing like Marcus had expected. He had imagined it would be some kind of tourist information desk, where he could explain the misunderstanding and be released with a warning. Instead, he found himself in a serious professional facility with multiple officers, security cameras, and the unmistakable atmosphere of law enforcement. Detective Inspector Sarah Collins had been called in specifically to handle the case. She was a 20-year veteran of the Metropolitan Police with extensive experience in cases involving assaults on public officials. She had seen entitled young men like Marcus before, and she knew exactly how these situations typically unfolded. "Mr. Thompson," she began, consulting the identification they had taken from his wallet, "do you understand why you're here?" Marcus had spent the last hour in a holding room, and his initial panic had transformed into indignant anger. His father hadn't answered his phone calls, and his friends had apparently disappeared entirely. He felt abandoned and betrayed, but he still couldn't accept that his actions might have been genuinely wrong. "This is completely blown out of proportion," he insisted. "I was just having a bit of fun with a tourist attraction. These guards are supposed to stand there and take it, right? That's literally their job." Detective Inspector Collins made a note on her pad. In her experience, suspects who referred to highly trained military personnel as tourist attractions rarely showed much capacity for growth or remorse. Mr. Thompson, the man you assaulted, is Guard Corporal James Mitchell, a decorated veteran with 6 years of service in the British Army, including 2 combat tours in Afghanistan. He's not a tourist attraction. He's a serving member of Her Majesty's Guard, and assaulting him is a serious criminal offense. For the first time, Marcus felt a genuine stab of fear. The word criminal had never been applied to anything he had done before. His worst previous encounter with authority had been a speeding ticket that his father's lawyer had made disappear. But he didn't even react. Marcus protested weakly. How can it be assault if he wasn't hurt? The detective's expression remained professionally neutral, but Marcus could sense her growing impatience with his attitude. "Physical harm isn't required for assault charges, Mr. Thompson. The law is very clear about unauthorized physical contact with on-duty security personnel, especially in sensitive locations like royal residences." Meanwhile, word of the incident was spreading through both official and unofficial channels. Within the military community, Guard Corporal James Mitchell was well known and respected. His calm professionalism under pressure had been noted by superiors, and his service record spoke of someone who consistently went above and beyond his duties. Colonel Robert Hayes, the commanding officer responsible for palace security, had reviewed the incident reports and the tourist videos that were already appearing on social media. He was impressed by James's restraint and discipline, but he was also furious about the assault itself. "This kind of behavior is completely unacceptable," he told his staff during an emergency briefing. "Our guards put their lives on the line for this country, and they deserve better than to be treated as entertainment by spoiled brats." The colonel's reaction represented something that Marcus had never encountered before: a system where merit mattered more than money, where respect was earned through service rather than purchased through privilege. Back in the interview room, Detective Inspector Collins was explaining the potential consequences of Marcus's actions. The charges could include assault, disturbing the peace, and potentially even threatening national security, depending on how the Crown Prosecution Service decided to proceed. "I want to call my father," Marcus demanded for the 10th time. "He knows people, he can sort this out." "Mr. Thompson, your father's connections won't change the fact that you physically assaulted a member of the Royal Guard in front of dozens of witnesses, many of whom filmed the entire incident." The reality of the situation was finally beginning to penetrate Marcus's thick wall of denial. The videos on social media weren't going away. The witnesses weren't going to change their stories. His father's money couldn't buy back the moment when he had chosen to kick a man who was simply doing his job. Detective Inspector Collins leaned forward slightly. "I've reviewed your background, Mr. Thompson. This appears to be your first encounter with the criminal justice system. If you were willing to acknowledge what you did wrong and show genuine remorse, there might be options for resolving this matter that don't involve a lengthy prison sentence." But Marcus still couldn't bring himself to admit fault. In his mind, he was the victim of an overreaction. The guard should have been flattered by the attention. The tourists should have found it entertaining. Everyone was taking this way too seriously. "Look, I'm sorry if people got upset," he said, his tone suggesting he was doing everyone a favor by apologizing. "But I still don't think this deserves criminal charges. Can't we just call it even and move on?" The detective made another note. She had been hoping to see some sign of genuine understanding or remorse, but Marcus was still focused entirely on avoiding consequences rather than accepting responsibility for his actions. At that moment, there was a knock on the interview room door. A uniformed officer entered and whispered something to Detective Inspector Collins. Her eyebrows rose slightly and she nodded. "Mr. Thompson." It appears that Guard Corporal Mitchell has requested to make a statement about the incident. This is unusual, as victims of assault typically aren't required to participate in the initial questioning phase. Marcus felt a surge of hope. Maybe the guard was going to say it wasn't a big deal after all. Maybe he would ask them to drop the charges. Maybe this nightmare was about to end. He had no idea that James Mitchell was about to deliver a lesson in dignity, service, and consequences that would change his life forever. Guard Corporal James Mitchell entered the interview room still in his full-dress uniform, though he had been officially relieved from duty for the remainder of his shift. His bearing was impeccable, his posture straight, and his expression calm and professional. Marcus had expected to see anger or frustration, but instead he faced the same composed dignity that had characterized James's behavior during the assault. Detective Inspector Collins gestured for James to take a seat across from Marcus. The two men looked at each other for a moment, and once again, Marcus felt that uncomfortable sensation of being truly seen by someone whose opinion actually mattered. "Guard Corporal Mitchell," the detective began, "would you please state your name and position for the record?" "James Robert Mitchell, Guard Corporal, 2nd Battalion Scots Guards, currently assigned to ceremonial duties at Buckingham Palace." His voice was clear, steady, and carried the authority of someone accustomed to being taken seriously. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Hearing James speak for the first time somehow made the situation more real. This wasn't just a uniformed figure anymore. This was an actual person with a name, a rank, and a military history that demanded respect. "Could you describe the events of this afternoon from your perspective?" Detective Inspector Collins asked. James's account was precise, professional, and devastatingly accurate. He described each escalation in Marcus's behavior, from the initial taunts to the physical contact with his hat, and finally to the assault itself. He spoke without emotion, but with the clarity of someone trained to observe and report accurately under pressure. The individual began with verbal harassment, which is not uncommon, and which I ignored according to protocol. However, when he made physical contact with my uniform and then escalated to actual assault, the situation crossed clearly defined lines. Marcus wanted to interrupt, to argue, to explain that it had all been just harmless fun. But something about James's quiet authority made him remain silent. "Guard Corporal Mitchell," the detective continued, "in your professional opinion, was this assault unprovoked?" "Completely unprovoked. I maintained perfect stillness and silence throughout the encounter. I made no gestures, gave no responses, and provided no provocation whatsoever for the individual's behavior." The detective made notes while James spoke. Then she asked the question that Marcus had been dreading. "What impact has this incident had on you, both personally and professionally?" For the first time, James's composure shifted slightly. Not with anger or self-pity, but with something that looked like disappointment. "Detective Inspector, I've served my country for 6 years. I've been deployed to combat zones where I've faced genuine threats and real danger. I've stood guard in all weather conditions, maintained discipline under extreme pressure, and taken pride in representing the best of what British military service means." He paused, his eyes moving briefly to Marcus before returning to the detective. "What happened today wasn't just an assault on me personally. It was an attack on everything that this uniform represents. When someone treats a member of Her Majesty's Guard as entertainment, they're showing disrespect not just to one soldier, but to every person who has ever served this country." Marcus felt his face flushing with shame. For the first time, he was beginning to understand that his actions had consequences beyond his own amusement. This man had dedicated his life to service, had put himself in harm's way for his country, and Marcus had treated him like a joke. James continued his statement, his voice remaining steady and professional. "I've served alongside men and women who have sacrificed everything for their country. Some of them didn't come home. Others came back with wounds that will never fully heal. When I put on this uniform, I carry their memory and their honor with me." The room was completely quiet. Even Detective Inspector Collins, who had heard thousands of victim statements over her career, was impressed by James's dignity and eloquence. "The individual who assaulted me today has probably never sacrificed anything for anyone other than himself. He clearly has no understanding of service, honor, or respect for others. But what concerns me most is that his behavior suggests he sees certain people as inferior, as existing solely for his entertainment. Marcus wanted to disappear. Every word James spoke was accurate, and every observation cut straight to the heart of who Marcus really was as a person. He had never been forced to confront his own character so directly. However, James continued, and Marcus looked up hopefully, thinking this might be where the guard would show mercy or ask for leniency. I believe this incident represents an opportunity, not for revenge or excessive punishment, but for education. This young man has clearly never learned that his actions have consequences, that other people deserve respect regardless of their profession, and that privilege comes with responsibility. Detective Inspector Collins leaned forward with interest. What would you recommend, Guard Corporal? James looked directly at Marcus for the first time since entering the room. I recommend that he be required to understand what service actually means, not through lectures or fines that his father can pay, but through genuine experience of putting others before himself. Marcus felt a chill of apprehension. This wasn't going the way he had hoped at all. I would like to request that, as part of any resolution to this matter, Mr. Thompson be required to perform community service with veterans organizations, homeless shelters, or other places where he can see what it means to serve others rather than expecting to be served. The detective was taking careful notes. Anything else, Guard Corporal? Yes. I would like him to write a formal letter of apology, not just to me but to every member of the military community. And I would like him to research and write a report about the role of the Royal Guard, including the training, dedication, and sacrifice required for this position. James stood up, his bearing still perfect despite everything that had happened. Detective Inspector, I don't want this young man's life to be ruined, but I do want him to learn that his actions have consequences, and that respect for others is not optional, regardless of one's social or economic status. As James left the room, Marcus sat in stunned silence. He had expected anger, demands for harsh punishment, or at least some display of personal emotion. Instead, he had encountered something much more powerful. A man whose response to assault was to offer an opportunity for growth and learning. For the first time in his life, Marcus was beginning to understand what real strength looked like. 3 months later, Marcus Thompson stood outside the Royal British Legion Community Centre in East London, wearing work clothes instead of his usual designer outfit. His hands were dirty from helping to prepare meals for homeless veterans, and his back ached from loading donation boxes all morning. It was 6 a.m. on a Saturday, a time when he used to be stumbling home from expensive nightclubs. The community service sentence had been exactly what James Mitchell had requested. 200 hours of service to veterans organizations, a formal, written apology to the military community, and a comprehensive research report on the history and importance of the Royal Guard. Marcus had initially been furious about the requirements, but his father's lawyers had explained that it was far better than the potential prison sentence he could have faced. The first few weeks had been torture. Marcus had never done manual labor in his life, and he certainly had never been required to serve others without receiving praise or recognition in return. He scrubbed floors in veterans' shelters, served food in soup kitchens, and listened to stories from men and women who had given parts of themselves in service to their country. Slowly, something began to change. It started with small moments of genuine connection. There was Frank, a 70-year-old veteran of the Falklands War who had been living on the streets for 3 years after losing his job and his home. Marcus had initially been annoyed by Frank's tendency to tell long stories about his military service, but gradually he began to listen with real interest. There was Sarah, a former Army medic who had lost her leg to an improvised explosive device in Iraq and was now struggling with PTSD while trying to rebuild her life. She never complained about her circumstances, but she spoke with quiet pride about her time in service and her determination to help other veterans facing similar challenges. There was David, a Royal Marine who had served 3 tours in Afghanistan and now volunteered his time helping other veterans find housing and employment. He had recognized Marcus from the news coverage of the Palace incident, but instead of treating him with hostility, He had quietly assigned him to tasks that would maximize his exposure to the real struggles facing former service members. The research project had been equally transformative. Marcus had initially approached it as a chore to be completed as quickly as possible, but as he delved deeper into the history of the Royal Guard, he began to understand the depth of tradition, training, and dedication involved in the role. He learned that becoming a Royal Guard required years of military training, impeccable discipline, and demonstrated excellence in one's regular military duties. These weren't just ceremonial figures. They were active duty soldiers who had earned their positions through merit and maintained them through constant professionalism. He discovered that the famous stoic composure wasn't just for show. Royal Guards were trained to remain focused on their primary duty of security, regardless of distractions. Their ability to ignore harassment wasn't weakness. It was a demonstration of mental toughness and professional dedication. The letter of apology had been the hardest part. Marcus had written and rewritten it dozens of times, struggling to find words that expressed genuine remorse rather than just a desire to complete his sentence. Each draft forced him to confront his own behavior and attitudes more honestly. In the final version he had written, "I behaved like someone who had never learned that other people deserve respect regardless of their profession or social status. I treated a decorated veteran as if he existed for my entertainment, and I failed to recognize the honor and sacrifice represented by his uniform. I am ashamed of my actions and committed to becoming someone worthy of the patience and forgiveness I have been shown." Now, as he finished his community service, Marcus realized that the punishment had become something else entirely. It had become an education in values he had never been taught: service, sacrifice, dignity, and respect for others. His relationship with his father had changed too. When Marcus had initially called for help after his arrest, his father had been furious not because of Marcus's behavior, but because of the embarrassment it caused the family. It had taken several weeks for Marcus to work up the courage to share what he was learning through his community service, but when he finally did, his father had listened with something approaching respect. "You're becoming the man I always hoped you could be," his father had said during their last conversation. "I gave you everything I thought you needed, but I never taught you why any of it mattered." Marcus's friends, Jake and Tommy, had initially avoided him after the incident, embarrassed by their association with his behavior and worried about their own reputations. But as word spread about his community service work, they had begun to reach out again, curious about the changes they were hearing about. On his final day of community service, Marcus received an unexpected visitor. Guard Corporal James Mitchell appeared at the community center, still carrying himself with the same quiet dignity that had impressed Marcus during their confrontation months earlier. "Mr. Thompson," James said simply, extending his hand for a handshake. Marcus felt his heart racing. This was the moment he had been both hoping for and dreading throughout his entire sentence. He had wondered if he would ever see James again, if he would have the opportunity to apologize in person, and what he would say if that moment came. "Guard Corporal Mitchell," Marcus replied, accepting the handshake. "I wasn't expecting to see you here. David mentioned you were completing your service today. I wanted to see for myself how you've spent these past few months." They walked through the community center together, with Marcus explaining the various programs he had worked on. He showed James the kitchen where he had served thousands of meals, the sleeping area where he had helped set up beds for homeless veterans, and the job training room where he had assisted former service members with resume writing and interview preparation. "The people here have taught me more in 3 months than I learned in 23 years, Marcus said quietly. "I had no idea what real strength looked like until I met Frank, who survived combat and homelessness with more dignity than I've ever shown in my entire privileged life." James nodded thoughtfully. "And what have you learned about service?" Marcus paused, trying to find the right words. "I learned that it's not about what you get back. Frank doesn't serve food here because anyone thanks him for it. Sarah doesn't counsel other veterans because it makes her feel good. They do it because they understand that we're all connected, that we have obligations to each other that go beyond our own comfort." "And what about respect?" James asked. I learned that respect can't be demanded or purchased. It has to be earned. Through actions, through consistency, through putting others before yourself. Marcus looked directly at James. I also learned that you showed me more respect by holding me accountable than anyone ever had by letting me get away with bad behavior. They sat down in the center's small coffee area surrounded by photos of veterans and their families. James poured 2 cups of coffee from a pot that Marcus had learned to make months earlier. "There's something I want you to know," James said. "When I made my statement to the police, I wasn't trying to punish you. I was trying to give you an opportunity that I never had." Marcus looked puzzled. "I grew up poor," James continued. "My father worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table, and my mother cleaned offices at night to pay for our school clothes. I learned about service and sacrifice because I had to. My family depended on me from the time I was 12 years old." He sipped his coffee thoughtfully. "You had everything handed to you, which meant no one ever gave you the chance to discover what you were capable of when it really mattered. I thought maybe, if you were required to serve others, you might find out who you really could be." Marcus felt tears welling up in his eyes. "I don't know how to thank you. You could have asked them to throw the book at me, and instead you gave me the greatest gift anyone has ever given me." "What's that?" James asked. "The chance to become someone I can respect when I look in the mirror." James smiled for the first time since Marcus had known him. "So what happens now?" "Your sentence is complete." Marcus had been thinking about this question for weeks. "I want to keep volunteering here. Not because I have to, but because I finally understand what it means to be part of something bigger than myself." He paused. "And I want to go back to school. Not business like my father wants, but social work. I want to help other people who grew up like I did to learn these lessons before they hurt someone the way I hurt you." James stood up and extended his hand again. "Mr. Thompson, it's been an honor watching your transformation. I believe you're going to make a real difference in people's lives." As James prepared to leave, Marcus called out to him, "Guard Corporal Mitchell, I know this might sound strange, but would you be willing to be a reference for my social work program applications? I think they should hear from someone who saw who I used to be and who I'm becoming." James turned back with a genuine smile. "It would be my privilege." 6 months later, Marcus started his first semester studying social work at King's College, London. He continued volunteering at the Veterans Center every weekend, and he had started a scholarship program for underprivileged young initially.